A new lesbian love story, Forbidden Love. Story of Sophie and Vivian being an emotional romance drama. Sophie's hands trembled as she stood in the doorway of her childhood home, watching her mother's face crumble into a mask of disgust and fury. The words hung in the air like shattered glass, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. Her mother had found the letters, all 23 of them, carefully hidden beneath the floorboards of Sophie's old bedroom. Letters filled with longing, with poetry, with the kind of love that Sophie had spent her entire 24 years believing she would never be allowed to feel. Letters written to Vivian, the woman who had walked into Sophie's carefully constructed life 6 months ago and turned everything into beautiful chaos. Now standing in that doorway with her suitcase at her feet and her mother's final words echoing in her ears, Sophie understood that loving Vivian meant choosing between the family who raised her and the person who made her feel truly alive for the first time in her existence. If you believe in the power of love that transcends boundaries, in kindness even when the world turns cruel, and in second chances for those brave enough to follow their hearts, please like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, share this story with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to channel name for more emotional stories that remind us of our shared humanity. The rain had started 6 months earlier on the day Sophie first saw Vivian. It was one of those sudden September storms that arrived without warning, turning the streets of their small conservative town into rivers of muddy water. Sophie had been running from her car to the library where she worked, her arms full of books that desperately needed to stay dry, when she collided with someone coming from the opposite direction. The books went flying, pages fluttering like wounded birds, and Sophie found herself looking up into the most extraordinary eyes she had ever seen. They were green, but not the simple green of grass or leaves. They held entire forests within them, depths and shadows and light all mixed together in a way that made Sophie forget how to breathe. Vivian had laughed, a sound like wind chimes on a summer evening, and knelt down to help gather the scattered books. Their fingers touched as they both reached for the same volume, and Sophie felt something shift inside her chest. Like a door she never knew existed had suddenly swung open. Vivian was new to town, an artist who had moved into the old Morrison house on the edge of the community. She was everything Sophie had been taught to fear and avoid. She wore her dark hair short, dressed in paint-stained jeans and leather jackets, and moved through the world with a confidence that seemed almost defiant in a place where women were expected to be soft-spoken and carefully composed. Sophie, by contrast, had spent her entire life trying to fit into the mold her family and community had created for her. She wore modest dresses, kept her blonde hair long and neat, attended church every Sunday with her parents, and had even been dating Marcus, the pastor's son, for 3 years because it was what everyone expected. But meeting Vivian was like seeing color for the first time after living in a world of gray. They kept running into each other after that first collision. Vivian would come to the library, always with a smile that seemed meant only for Sophie, always finding reasons to linger at the circulation desk and talk. She spoke about art and travel, about places Sophie had only read about in books. She talked about Paris in the spring and Morocco in the winter, about sleeping under stars, in the Australian outback and watching the northern lights dance over Iceland. Sophie found herself staying late at work, just for the chance that Vivian might come in. She began to notice the way Vivian's eyes crinkled when she laughed, the way her voice dropped to something intimate and warm when they were alone, the way her presence made Sophie's heart race in a way that 3 years with Marcus never had. The friendship deepened through October and November. They started meeting for coffee at the small cafe on Main Street, though Sophie always chose tables in the back corner, where they were less likely to be seen. Vivian never pushed, never asked why Sophie seemed so nervous about being spotted together, but there was a knowing sadness in her eyes that made Sophie's chest ache. Vivian had been through this before in other small towns, in other places where love that didn't fit neat categories was treated as something shameful and wrong. She had learned to recognize the signs of someone fighting against their own truth, and she saw all of those signs in Sophie, but she also saw something else, a spark of courage that was just waiting for permission to ignite. The shift happened on a cold December evening when Sophie's car broke down on the rural road near Vivian's house. She had been driving home from work, her mind spinning with thoughts she kept trying to suppress when the engine simply died. With shaking fingers, she called Vivian, who arrived within minutes and insisted Sophie come inside while they waited for the tow truck. Vivian's home was unlike anything Sophie had ever seen. The walls were covered with paintings, vibrant explosions, of color that seemed to pulse with life and emotion. There were canvases everywhere, some finished, some barely begun, all of them speaking to a passion and freedom that Sophie had never allowed herself to feel. Vivian made tea and they sat by the fireplace. And for the first time in months, Sophie felt the walls she had built around herself beginning to crumble. They talked for hours that night. Sophie found herself saying things she had never spoken aloud before, admitting feelings she had spent years trying to bury. She talked about the loneliness of living a life that felt like a performance, about the suffocating weight of expectations, about the fear that had become her constant companion. Vivian listened without judgment, her eyes soft with understanding, and when Sophie finally fell silent, exhausted by the weight of her confessions, Vivian reached across the small space between them and took her hand. It was such a simple gesture, fingers intertwining with fingers, but it felt like the most revolutionary act Sophie had ever participated in. In that moment, holding Vivian's hand in the firelight, Sophie finally acknowledged the truth she had been running from her entire life. The first kiss happened that night, tentative and terrifying and more beautiful than anything Sophie had ever experienced. It was nothing like kissing Marcus, which had always felt like checking a box on a list of things good Christian girls were supposed to do. Kissing Vivian felt like coming home to a place Sophie had never known existed. It felt like music and sunlight, and every good thing in the world condensed into a single moment. They stayed up until dawn, talking and kissing and crying. And when Sophie finally left as the sun was rising, she knew her life would never be the same. The months that followed were a study in contradiction. Sophie had never been happier, but she had also never been more terrified. She began living a double life, spending her days maintaining the facade of the dutiful daughter and perfect girlfriend, and her evenings and secret afternoons with Vivian. They would meet at Vivian's house, careful to ensure no one saw Sophie's car parked outside. They would spend hours wrapped in each other's arms, talking about dreams and fears, making love with a tenderness that made Sophie weep, creating a private world where they could simply be themselves. Vivian painted Sophie dozens of times, capturing her in moments of joy and vulnerability that Sophie barely recognized. In Vivian's art, Sophie saw herself as she truly was, radiant and alive and free. But the weight of secrecy was crushing. Sophie found herself lying constantly, making up excuses for where she had been and why she seemed different. Marcus noticed the change in her and pressed for a wedding date, unable to understand why the woman who had once seemed content with their arrangement now looked at him with something close to pity. Sophie's mother began making comments about Sophie's appearance, about how she seemed distracted and unfocused, about how she was spending too much time alone. The walls were closing in, and Sophie knew that something would have to break. The breaking point came in late spring when Sophie realized she couldn't continue living the lie. She broke things off with Marcus first, sitting with him in his car, outside the church and trying to explain without really explaining. Marcus was hurt and confused, unable to comprehend why Sophie would throw away a perfectly good relationship. He asked if there was someone else, and Sophie's silence was answer enough. When Marcus's mother called Sophie's mother that same evening, the machinery of small-town gossip began grinding into motion. Within days, speculation was running wild through the community. Sophie felt the eyes following her everywhere she went, felt the whispers cutting through the air like knives. She tried to wait, tried to let the attention die down before making any more dramatic moves. But her mother was relentless. She cornered Sophie one evening, demanding to know what was going on, insisting that Sophie fix things with Marcus before his family was too offended to forgive. Sophie, exhausted by months of hiding and lying, made the mistake of writing everything down in a letter to Vivian that she planned to deliver the next day. She poured out her heart, wrote about her love and her fear, about her desperate desire to simply live honestly and openly with the woman she loved. She hid the letter with all the others beneath the floorboards, a temporary storage place until she could decide what to do. But her mother, suspicious and determined, found them while Sophie was at work. She read every single one, and by the time Sophie came home that evening, Her father was waiting with her mother in the living room, their faces carved from stone. The confrontation was brutal. Her mother screamed about sin and shame, about how Sophie was throwing away her immortal soul for a perversion. Her father said nothing, but the disappointment in his eyes was somehow worse than her mother's rage. They gave her an ultimatum: leave Vivian and seek counseling to fix herself, or leave their home and never come back. They would tell everyone that Sophie had moved away for a job opportunity, saving face for the family, but if Sophie chose Vivian, she would be dead to them. No contact, no relationship, no place in the family anymore. Sophie stood in that living room, feeling like she was being torn in half. She thought about the life she was being asked to abandon, the comfort, the security, the approval of her community. She thought about holidays and family dinners, about nieces and nephews she might never meet, about the possibility of reconciliation that would disappear the moment she walked out the door. But then she thought about Vivian, about the way loving her had finally made Sophie feel like herself. She thought about living another 40 or 50 years as a ghost, going through the motions of a life that would never truly be hers. She thought about the person she saw in Vivian's paintings, radiant and real and unafraid. The choice, when it came down to it, was terrifying but clear. Sophie packed her bags that night while her mother watched in stony silence. She took only what she could carry, leaving behind photo albums and childhood mementos and all the trappings of the life she had been expected to live. She called Vivian from the driveway, her voice breaking as she explained what had happened. Vivian's response was immediate. "Come home," she said, as if her small house had always been Sophie's true home. And perhaps it had been. Perhaps home had never been a building or a town or a family's approval. Perhaps home had always been wherever Sophie could be fully herself. If this story has touched your heart, if you felt the courage it takes to choose love over fear, please take a moment to leave a like on this video. Comment below with your thoughts or your own experiences of finding the strength to be true to yourself. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Your engagement helps spread these important stories to people who need hope and validation. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Sophie's life, but also the most honest. She moved in with Vivian, and together they began building a life that was entirely their own. Sophie found work at a library in the next town over, a place where no one knew her history or her family's name. The loss of her family was a constant ache, a grief that would wake her in the middle of the night and leave her sobbing in Vivian's arms. But alongside that grief was a growing sense of peace. She no longer had to monitor every word, every gesture, every expression. She could hold Vivian's hand in public, could kiss her goodbye in the morning, could introduce her as my girlfriend without fear. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. They faced challenges, of course. Money was tight, and there were people in their new community who looked at them with suspicion or disgust. But there were also unexpected allies, the elderly neighbor who brought them cookies and never asked invasive questions, the owner of the local bookshop who hired Sophie part-time when she mentioned looking for extra work, the couple who lived 2 streets over and had been together for 30 years and welcomed them to neighborhood gatherings with warm smiles. Sophie was learning that family could be chosen, that home could be built from courage and honesty rather than inherited through blood. 1 year after that terrible night in her parents' doorway, Sophie stood in Vivian's art studio watching her paint. The canvas showed 2 women standing on a cliff overlooking the ocean, their hands clasped together, their faces turned toward a sunrise that painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. It was beautiful and hopeful, a vision of the future they were building together. Vivian turned and caught Sophie watching, and the smile that spread across her face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. They had lost so much to be together, but they had also gained everything that mattered. They had gained the freedom to love openly, to live honestly, to build a life that belonged entirely to them. Before we end this story, I want to ask you something. If Sophie and Vivian's journey has resonated with you, please type the word love in the comments below. Let's create a chain of support and solidarity for everyone who has ever had to choose between acceptance and authenticity. Sophie knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be difficult days and painful moments. There might even come a time when her family would reach out, and she would have to decide how to respond. But standing there in that studio, Surrounded by Vivian's art and wrapped in Vivian's love, Sophie felt something she had never experienced in her parents' house. She felt free. She felt whole. She felt for the first time in her entire life, like the person she saw in the mirror was the same person she was inside, and that feeling, she realized, was worth everything she had sacrificed to claim it. Forbidden love had become the very thing that set her free. And in choosing Vivian, Sophie had finally chosen herself.